All right, so this is just a quick reality check on the glmDemo dataset, just to make sure that the alignments and everything seem to be going okay. So just to orient you here, so this is the dataset as downloaded from the website. One thing you might want to do is, if you are using a more recent version of MATLAB, it might be worth removing MR last view, because the way some of the graphics objects are being handled within newer versions of MATLAB is slightly broken. So you might get some error messages to do with that. So here what I'm going to do is MR last view. I'm just going to move it out of the way. I'm going to say backup underscore MR last view.mat. If I start Mr. Loader, that means I won't have any anatomies loaded in, or any of the overlay maps, or any of the stuff that's stored in there. So that's a bit of a gotcha here in this particular case. So what's going on here is, say view, remove base anatomy, load in as the base anatomy from current scan. All right, and then what we can do here is just to see what's happening without actually looking back at the web page, is to try and see whether with time course plot we can look at some of the time series here, what the answer is. Okay, so it's a 3D data set, 4D data set, sorry. Another thing we could have done is group info and look at raw. And you can see there's run 1 and run 2, TR slightly odd, 1.05 seconds. So that all looks pretty decent, okay? So one thing to double check whether some of the alignment issues are happening here is, what we could do is just run a quick time series stats on both of them is fine. It should be pretty quick, only a few seconds. Right, and so it puts the overlay into place, and so this all looks pretty straightforward, right? So if we go to, say, the mean map here, we can change the threshold, or we can change the alpha, and you should be able to see that that overlays very nicely onto the data set from which the images were derived, right? It sort of has to be the case, because the scan space defines the space in which the statistical maps are stored, because essentially it just makes a 3D version of the 4D file, and so the alignment info and everything is should be matching. So the next thing to check now is what happens when we load in one of the other anatomy images that should have been aligned for this data set already, right? So there's no real need to do the MR align step as far as I remember from this particular thing. So if I load in base anatomy, I read in the 3D anatomy image, which is the high resolution data set for this particular person, then it looks like actually this particular data set is aligned, right? So let me just switch to the other view, coronal and sagittal. So you notice that the anatomical labels are correct, and it looks like the superimposed statistical maps fit nicely with what's actually there in the anatomical image. One thing that you may find weird is that the orientation of the actual anatomical image is a bit odd. Okay, so but that's just a display issue, and so what we could do is we could try and rotate this particular view, say by 90 degrees. And in this case, we can now look at this particular image in a slightly more natural orientation for viewing, right? So somewhere in the middle. This should be mid-sagittal here. And we could do the same thing for the coronal view, which might also be off in terms. Oh, actually, this looks fine. Sagittal, coronal, and axial looks fine from this point here. So let's go here, go up a little bit further. Yeah, so this looks pretty decent. So the question now is whether when we perform the analysis with the GLM code, whether the resulting maps should be the same, but in theory they get created in exactly the same space as the time series statistics, so they should really match. So one final check here is if we load in as another base anatomy the in-plane scans that were loaded for this particular person as well. These are slightly higher res images in exactly the same slice prescription as the fMRI data. Once again, you know, slightly odd orientations may be here for you to look at, but we can rotate these by 90 degrees and look at them maybe in this way. Yeah, so coronal looks fine. Sagittal also looks fine, right? So so the underlying images here are T1 weighted, but they have the same slice prescription as the fMRI data, which might be helpful for other steps of alignment. Okay.